I'm Cindy Rooney, 21 years old, and I earned the title of United States Marine after 13 of the hardest weeks of my life. For years, I bent over backwards trying to win my family's approval, sacrificing sleep, opportunities, even my own sense of worth, just to hear a word of pride. But on the morning of my graduation, when my father laughed and said, "She's not worthy of that uniform," I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been mocked or humiliated by the very people you gave everything to? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand tall after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up in a house where good was never good enough. My father kept score of everything: grades, achievements, behavior, and somehow I always fell short. When I brought home a 95, he'd ask about the missing 5 points. When I made varsity, he'd mention the girls who were team captains. My mother followed his lead, offering praise so faint it felt like criticism wrapped in a softer voice. The pattern started early. I was 7 when I won the school spelling bee, and while other parents were taking pictures and buying ice cream, mine were already talking about next year's competition and how I'd need to study harder if I wanted to win again. The trophy sat on my dresser for exactly 1 week before my father moved it to the basement, saying we didn't need to get ahead of ourselves. By high school, I'd learned to manage my expectations. I worked harder than anyone I knew, staying up until midnight on projects, volunteering for extra credit, taking on leadership roles, but I did it quietly. The hope was always there, buried deep, that one day they'd look at me with genuine pride. That one day, something I did would be enough. My junior year, I earned a full academic scholarship to college. The letter came on a Tuesday, and I remember reading it 3 times before I fully believed it. I ran downstairs with the paper in my hands, breathless and smiling wider than I had in months. My father was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. He looked up when I started talking, listened to me explain about the scholarship, the honor, the recognition. When I finished, he nodded once and said, "Good. Now you won't be a financial burden." My mother patted my shoulder and said it was nice, but reminded me that scholarships came with expectations, and I'd need to work even harder now. The conversation lasted maybe 2 minutes before they moved on to discussing dinner plans. I stood there holding the letter, feeling like I'd just told them about the weather. That night, lying in bed, I made a decision that surprised even me. I was tired of performing for an audience that would never applaud. Tired of shrinking myself to fit into their narrow definition of worthy. I'd spent 16 years trying to earn something that wasn't for sale, and I was exhausted from the effort. The scholarship meant freedom, not just financial, but emotional. For the first time, I could make choices based on what I wanted instead of what might finally impress them. I could stop measuring myself against their impossible standards and start figuring out who I was when I wasn't trying to be perfect. College was different. My professors noticed my work. My peers respected my ideas. I discovered I was capable of leadership when I wasn't constantly second-guessing myself. I joined organizations, took on responsibilities, made friends who actually celebrated my successes instead of immediately pointing out what could be better. But even with all that distance and growth, part of me still hoped things would change at home. During visits, I'd catch myself straightening my posture when my father walked into the room, choosing my words carefully to avoid giving him ammunition for criticism. The old habits died hard. My senior year, something shifted. I was taking a military history course and the professor was a retired Marine colonel. He had a way of talking about service that I'd never heard before, not as duty or obligation, but as purpose. He spoke about belonging to something bigger than yourself, about earning respect through action rather than words, about finding family among people who understood what it meant to fight for each other. After class one day, I lingered to ask him questions. He told me stories about young people who'd found direction through military service, who'd discovered strengths they didn't know they possessed. He didn't push or recruit, he just talked, and I listened. That evening, I called my best friend Cindy to talk through what I was feeling. She'd known my family since we were kids, had witnessed their particular brand of conditional love up close. You know what I think, she said after I explained my interest in the military. I think you're looking for people who will have your back no matter what. People who see your value without you having to prove it every single day. She was right, though I couldn't admit it then. I was looking for a family that would choose me the same way I chose them. I wanted to belong somewhere my effort was recognized, where my commitment was valued, where good enough was actually good enough. The research process took months. I studied different branches, different career paths, different ways to serve. The Marines kept drawing me back, something about their reputation for excellence, their emphasis on honor and integrity, their promise that every Marine earns their place regardless of background. I didn't tell my parents right away. I wanted to be sure, wanted to have all the facts before I opened myself up to their judgment. I talked to recruiters, attended information sessions, took practice tests. Everything pointed in the same direction. The night I finally decided to enlist, I sat at my desk writing out all the reasons why this was right for me. I filled 3 pages with thoughts about service, about challenge, about finding my place in the world. At the bottom, in small letters, I wrote, "Maybe they'll finally be proud of me." I crossed it out immediately, embarrassed by my own honesty. This wasn't supposed to be about them anymore. This was supposed to be about me, about my future, about what I wanted from my life. But the words had been true when I wrote them, and erasing them didn't make the feeling disappear. The next morning, I told them over breakfast. I'd rehearsed the conversation, anticipated their questions, prepared for their objections. I explained my reasoning clearly and calmly, emphasizing the leadership opportunities, the career prospects, the chance to serve my country. My father put down his coffee cup and stared at me for a long moment. Then he started laughing, not a happy laugh, but the kind that cuts. "You? In the military? They'll eat you alive." My mother's response was gentler, but no less devastating. "Honey, you're not really the military type. Maybe you should think about this a little more." For 17 years, I'd been conditioned to absorb their doubt, to let it shape my own sense of what was possible. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the distance college had given me, or maybe it was finally understanding that their limitations weren't mine. Whatever it was, I heard their words and felt something I'd never felt before, determination instead of devastation. "I've already signed the papers," I said quietly. "I leave for boot camp in 3 months." The silence that followed was thick with everything we'd never said to each other. When I first mentioned enlisting to extended family at my cousin's wedding, the comments started immediately. My uncle laughed and said I'd probably wash out in the first week. My aunt asked if I was sure I was tough enough for military life. They weren't being cruel, exactly, they thought they were being realistic. But their realism felt like a judgment of everything I was and everything I could become. At family dinners, the teasing became routine. They'd joke about me dropping and giving them 20, or ask if I was practicing my salute. When I started working out more seriously to prepare for training, they'd make comments about me playing soldier. The tone was light, almost affectionate, but there was an edge underneath that made it clear they didn't take any of this seriously. My father's friends got involved too. During a barbecue, one of them looked me up and down and said, "You sure you're cut out for this? The military's not for everyone." Another asked if I'd considered easier options, like the Coast Guard or the Air Force, as if my choice of the Marines was some kind of mistake that needed correcting. The worst part was how they talked about it when they thought I wasn't listening. I'd walk into a room and catch the end of conversations about how I was going through a phase, how I'd come to my senses eventually. They made bets about how long I'd last. My father's voice carried when he told his brother, "Give it 6 months. She'll be back home with her tail between her legs." I started avoiding family gatherings when I could, making excuses about work or school. But some events were unavoidable, and I'd find myself sitting through dinner while they peppered me with questions designed to highlight how unprepared I was. They'd ask about weapons training, about combat scenarios, about whether I was ready to take orders from people younger than me. Every question felt like a test I was expected to fail. My mother tried to soften it sometimes, redirecting the conversation or changing the subject. But she never defended me directly, never told them to back off or that their comments were inappropriate. Her silence felt like agreement, like she was just as convinced as they were that I was making a mistake. Friends from college had different reactions. Some were supportive, even excited for me. Others were confused but respectful. But my family's doubt was louder than any encouragement I received elsewhere. Their voices followed me to the gym, whispered in my ear during practice tests, made me question myself in quiet moments when I was already struggling with fear about what lay ahead. The comments escalated as my departure date approached. What started as gentle teasing became more pointed, more personal. They questioned my motives, suggested I was running away from problems rather than facing them. They brought up every time I'd quit something as a child, piano lessons I'd abandoned, sports teams I'd left mid-season as evidence that I couldn't stick with difficult things. My father's criticism became more specific. He'd point out that I'd never been in a fight, never faced real physical danger, never had to follow orders from someone I didn't respect. He'd list all the ways military life would be different from my sheltered existence, all the reasons I was unprepared for what I was walking into. The night before I left for boot camp, he pulled me aside for what I thought might be a supportive father-daughter moment. Instead, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "You know you can come home anytime, right? When this doesn't work out, we won't say I told you so." It was meant to be reassurance, but it felt like prophecy. Like he'd already written the story of my failure and was just waiting for me to live it out. I nodded and thanked him because I didn't know what else to do. But lying in bed that night, I made a promise to myself that I'd prove them wrong, whatever it took. The skepticism wasn't entirely unfounded. I wasn't the obvious choice for military service. I was quiet, bookish, more comfortable with ideas than action. I'd never been particularly athletic or aggressive. In high school, I was the girl who reminded teachers about homework assignments, not the one who got in trouble or pushed boundaries. But what they didn't understand was that I'd been training for this my whole life without knowing it. Every time they'd told me I wasn't good enough, I'd found a way to get better. Every time they'd expected me to quit, I'd dug in deeper. Their doubt had become my motivation, and I was ready to use 17 years of stored determination to prove that they'd underestimated me. Boot camp would either validate their predictions or shatter them completely. Either way, I was about to find out who I really was when everything comfortable was stripped away. Graduation day was supposed to be the vindication I'd been working toward for 13 weeks. I'd survived everything the drill instructors could throw at me, the physical challenges, the mental pressure, the complete reconstruction of who I thought I was. I'd earned my place among Marines, earned the right to call myself one of them. After months of proving myself to the toughest critics I'd ever faced, I was ready to show my family what I'd accomplished. They drove down from Ohio for the ceremony, along with my aunt and uncle who'd been particularly vocal about my chances of success. I'd written them letters throughout training, sharing some of what I was learning and experiencing, hoping to give them a glimpse of the person I was becoming. Their responses had been polite but non-committal, no acknowledgement of my progress, no recognition of what I was accomplishing. The morning of graduation, I met them for breakfast at their hotel. I walked into the restaurant in my dress blues, and for a moment, I thought I saw something like pride flash across my mother's face. But my father's first comment was about how the uniform made me look older, not in a good way. My uncle joked about whether I'd learned to march in a straight line yet. During the meal, they asked questions about what would happen after graduation, whether I was having second thoughts, whether the military was really what I'd expected. Every question felt loaded, like they were fishing for evidence that I was ready to admit this had all been a mistake. When I talked about my future assignments, about the training I'd receive, about the career path I was excited to pursue, they nodded politely but didn't engage with any real enthusiasm. My aunt made a comment about how different I seemed, and not entirely in a positive way. She said I was more serious, less fun than I used to be. My father agreed, saying military life had made me rigid, that I'd lost some of my personality. The implication was clear. The Marines had taken something from me rather than giving me something valuable. As we walked toward the parade ground for the ceremony, I could feel the distance between us growing with every step. Here I was, about to graduate from one of the most challenging training programs in the world, and they were treating it like a phase I needed to grow out of. They weren't seeing me as a Marine, they were seeing me as their daughter who was playing dress-up. We found seats in the stands, and I left them there to join my fellow graduates. Walking away from them, I felt a familiar hollow feeling in my chest. I'd spent 13 weeks becoming someone I was proud of, someone strong and capable and worthy of respect. But 5 minutes with my family, and I was back to feeling like the child who could never quite measure up to their expectations. The ceremony began with the traditional pageantry, the colors, the music, the formal presentation of arms. I stood in formation with my platoon, surrounded by men and women who'd become closer to me than my own siblings. We'd been through hell together, had each other's backs when everything seemed impossible, celebrated each other's victories, and lifted each other up through failures. Looking out at the crowd, I could see hundreds of families beaming with pride, taking pictures, wiping away tears. Parents who understood what their children had accomplished, who recognized the significance of this moment. I found my family in the stands and watched them whispering among themselves, my father checking his watch, my mother looking around at other families with what seemed like confusion about why everyone else was so emotional. Then I heard it, laughter. Not the happy kind that comes from joy, but the mocking kind I'd grown up with. They were laughing at something, loud enough that the people around them were starting to notice. I couldn't hear what they were saying from where I stood, but I could see their faces, could recognize the expressions I'd been seeing my whole life when they found something about me amusing. The laughter continued throughout the opening remarks, during the presentation of colors, through the speeches about honor and sacrifice and service. Every time I glanced in their direction, they seemed to be sharing some private joke, completely disconnected from the solemnity and significance of what was happening around them. When the moment came for individual recognition, when families were supposed to stand and cheer for their Marines, I steeled myself for polite applause at best. But what I got was worse than silence. As my name was called and I stepped forward to receive my recognition, I heard my father's voice carry across the parade ground, loud enough for everyone in our section to hear, "She's not worthy of that uniform." The words hit me like a physical blow. After everything I'd been through, everything I'd survived and accomplished, he still saw me as inadequate. Not just inadequate, unworthy. In front of hundreds of strangers, in front of my fellow Marines, in front of everyone who mattered to me, he declared that I didn't deserve to be standing there. The silence that followed his words was deafening. I felt every eye in the stands on me, felt the weight of judgment and pity and embarrassment crushing down. This was supposed to be my moment of triumph, the day I proved to myself and everyone else that I belonged here. Instead, it had become another opportunity for my father to remind me that I'd never be good enough for him. Standing there in formation, I felt something break inside me. Not my resolve that remained intact, but the last vestige of hope that they might someday see me the way I needed them to see me. The fantasy that this day might finally bridge the gap between us, that my accomplishments might finally be enough to earn their respect and approval. I blinked back tears and fixed my eyes straight ahead, the way I'd been trained to do when everything inside me wanted to fall apart. Around me, my fellow Marines stood steady, my brothers and sisters who understood what it meant to earn your place through blood and sweat and determination. They couldn't undo what my father had said, but their presence reminded me that I wasn't standing there alone. The ceremony continued around me, but I was no longer fully present. Part of me was still that 7-year-old girl whose spelling bee trophy wasn't good enough, still the teenager whose scholarship was just a way to avoid being a burden, still the daughter who'd spent her whole life trying to become someone her parents could love without reservation. But another part of me, the Marine part, was already moving beyond their judgment, already planning a future where their opinion wouldn't dictate my worth. Sitting in formation after my father's words cut through the morning air, I felt the familiar burn of shame rise in my throat. But this time, something was different. Instead of swallowing it and shrinking into myself the way I'd done my whole life, I held my head higher and kept my eyes forward. The Marine beside me, Rodriguez, caught my eye and gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible, but enough to remind me that I wasn't alone. "Ignore it," he whispered without moving his lips, a skill we'd all perfected during 13 weeks of training. "You earned this." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything we'd been through together. Rodriguez had watched me struggle through the obstacle course until I could complete it blindfolded. He'd seen me push through the crucible when every muscle in my body was screaming for mercy. He knew what I'd sacrificed, what I'd overcome, what I'd proven to myself and everyone around me. I thought back to that first day of boot camp, when I'd stood trembling in line with dozens of other recruits, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. The drill instructor had looked us over like we were defective merchandise, his voice cutting through our illusions about what the next 3 months would hold. "Half of you don't belong here," he'd shouted. "My job is to find out which half." In that moment, I'd been certain I was part of the half that didn't belong. I was smaller than most of the other recruits, weaker, less prepared for the physical demands that lay ahead. When they started dropping people in the first week, some for injuries, others for inability to keep up, I'd expected my name to be called any day. But something had happened during those first brutal weeks. Every time they told me I wasn't fast enough, I got faster. Every time they said I wasn't strong enough, I found strength I didn't know I possessed. Every time they pushed me beyond what I thought were my limits, I discovered that my limits were just illusions I'd been carrying around my whole life. The transformation hadn't been just physical. Growing up, I'd been conflict avoidant, always backing down rather than standing up for myself. But the Marines didn't allow that luxury. When another recruit tried to intimidate me during week 4, something new rose up inside me. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of steel resolve I'd never felt before. I stood my ground, looked her in the eye, and made it clear that I wasn't going anywhere. The obstacle course had been my biggest fear and eventually became my greatest triumph. The first time I tried to scale the rope wall, I'd fallen halfway up, landing hard enough to knock the wind out of me. The drill instructor had looked down at me and said, "Some people are climbers, some people are quitters. Which one are you?" I'd gotten up, grabbed that rope again, and tried again. And again. And again. It took me 2 weeks longer than anyone else in my platoon, but the day I finally made it over that wall, the cheers from my fellow Marines were louder than anything I'd ever heard. They'd watched me fail and get back up so many times that my success felt like their success too. The crucible had been different, not just a test of physical ability, but of everything we'd learned about being Marines. 54 hours of challenges designed to push us beyond exhaustion, beyond comfort, beyond the point where we could rely on individual strength alone. We'd had to work as a team, trust each other completely, refuse to leave anyone behind. During hour 38, when my legs were shaking and my vision was blurring from fatigue, I'd wanted to quit more than I'd wanted anything in my life. But Rodriguez and Jackson had flanked me, literally holding me up when I couldn't hold myself up. They'd carried my pack when I couldn't carry it myself, shared their water when mine was empty, reminded me why I was there when I'd forgotten. That's when I'd understood what my family had never grasped. Strength isn't just about individual achievement. It's about being worthy of other people's trust, about proving that you'll be there for them when everything falls apart. My fellow Marines hadn't cared about my test scores or my college degree or any of the things my family used to measure worth. They'd cared about whether I'd have their backs when it mattered, and I'd proven that I would. The night before graduation, our drill instructor had given us his final speech. He looked at each of us individually, these people who'd arrived as confused recruits and were leaving as Marines. When his eyes met mine, he'd nodded once, the kind of acknowledgement that meant everything because it was earned, not given. "You're not the same people who walked in here 13 weeks ago," he'd said. "Some of you didn't think you'd make it. Some of your families didn't think you'd make it. But you're here because you chose to be here, every single day, even when it was harder than anything you'd ever done before." Sitting in formation now, listening to my father's words echo across the parade ground, I realized that nothing he said could take away what I'd learned about myself. He could question my worthiness, but he hadn't been there when I'd proven it to the only people whose opinions truly mattered, my fellow Marines and myself. The drill instructor's voice came back to me. "A Marine is made, not born. You've all been made, forged by fire and pressure and the refusal to quit when quitting would be easier." I had been made. Not by my family's expectations or their approval, but by my own determination and the brotherhood of people who'd seen me at my weakest and helped me become my strongest. Their laughter couldn't unmake what had been forged in me over these 13 weeks. Quietly, sitting straighter in formation, I made a promise to myself. Their words wouldn't define this day, wouldn't diminish what I'd accomplished, wouldn't determine who I was or who I would become. For the first time in my life, I had proof that I was enough, not because someone else said so, but because I'd tested myself against the hardest standards I could find and emerged victorious. Whatever happened next, whatever they said or didn't say, I would stand proud. Not for them, but for me, and for the Marines sitting beside me who knew exactly what that pride had cost. The ceremony continued around me, but I was ready now. Ready for my name to be called, ready to stand and be recognized, ready to claim my place among Marines regardless of whether my family understood what that meant. I'd spent 13 weeks learning to be proud of myself, and no one could take that lesson away from me. When the drums began, I felt the familiar military precision settling over the ceremony like a ritual I'd learned to love. The deep, rhythmic beat that meant something important was about to happen, something that connected us to every Marine who'd come before us and every Marine who would come after. I'd been through enough ceremonies now to know that the drums meant, pay attention, stand ready, prepare to honor something bigger than yourself. I braced myself for the standard progression, the march, the salutes, the formal recognition of our achievement. What I hadn't braced for was the internal work I was doing, the way I was consciously choosing to let my family's reaction fade into background noise. For once in my life, I wasn't going to shrink to accommodate their discomfort or their disapproval. This was my moment, earned through blood and sweat, and the kind of determination I'd never known I possessed. I'd survived 13 weeks of the most challenging training in the world, not because I was naturally gifted or because it came easily, but because I'd refused to quit when quitting would have been the logical choice. Every day, I'd made the decision to stay, to push through, to become worthy of wearing this uniform. My decision was simple but revolutionary for someone who'd spent 21 years trying to manage other people's expectations. I would stand proud regardless of what they said or didn't say, what they felt or didn't feel, what they understood or failed to understand about what I'd accomplished. Growing up, I'd measured my worth by their reactions. A smile meant I was good, silence meant I was average, criticism meant I was failing. I'd organized my entire sense of self around their approval, changing my behavior, my interests, my goals to try to earn something that was apparently not for sale. But the Marines had taught me a different way to measure worth, through action, through commitment, through the respect of people who knew what it meant to earn their place. My drill instructors hadn't cared about my family's opinion of me. My fellow recruits hadn't been impressed by my college degree or my scholarships. What mattered here was simple. Could I do the work? Could I be trusted? Could I prove that I belonged among warriors? The answer was yes. Not because someone told me so, but because I demonstrated it day after day, challenge after challenge, failure after failure until failure became learning and learning became mastery. Sitting in formation, I felt something I'd never experienced before, complete ownership of my achievements. This wasn't something that had happened to me or been given to me. This was something I'd built with my own hands, forged in my own fire, created through my own refusal to accept limitations, theirs or mine. The drums grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the energy building in our ranks. Whatever was about to happen, we were ready for it. We'd been trained to be ready for anything, to adapt and overcome, to face challenges head-on rather than hoping they'd disappear. I thought about the night before, when Rodriguez had asked me if I was nervous about the ceremony. A little, I'd admitted. Not about the ceremony itself, but about after. About what comes next. He nodded like he understood. The hardest part isn't proving yourself to the core, he'd said. The hardest part is figuring out how to live with people who never saw you prove it. At the time, I'd thought he was talking about the civilian world, about the challenges of maintaining military values in a non-military environment. Now I realized he'd been talking about something more personal, about the family members and old friends who would always see you as the person you used to be, not the person you'd become. But that was their limitation, not mine. They could choose to see me as the uncertain girl who'd left for boot camp 13 weeks ago, or they could choose to see me as the Marine who was about to graduate. Either way, I knew who I was now, and their perception couldn't change that reality. The drums reached a crescendo, and I felt my spine straighten automatically, not from training, but from pride. Whatever happened next, I was ready to receive it as a Marine, with all the dignity and strength that identity carried. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't performing for an audience. I wasn't hoping for approval or bracing for disappointment. I was simply present, fully myself, ready to claim what I'd earned without apology or explanation. The internal transformation was as significant as anything that had happened to me during training. I'd learned to be proud of myself on my own terms, to value my achievements based on what they'd cost me rather than how others reacted to them. I'd learned that respect isn't something you beg for, it's something you command through your actions and your refusal to accept anything less than what you've earned. My family's laughter had stopped, I realized. The stands had grown quiet, expectant. Something was building, and even they could sense it. But for once, I wasn't worried about their reaction. Whatever was about to happen, I would meet it as myself, fully, proudly, without reservation. The drums continued, and I prepared to stand proud, not for them, but for me, and for every Marine who understood what it meant to earn your place in the world through determination rather than inheritance, through action rather than expectation, through the kind of courage that says, "This is who I am, and I will not apologize for taking up space in the world." The commander stood, and suddenly everything changed. What had been a standard graduation ceremony transformed into something I'd never seen before, something that made my heart pound with a mixture of confusion and growing realization. One by one, every Marine in the stands, active duty, retired, veterans who'd come to support their own family members, began to rise. It started with the front rows, the senior officers and NCOs, their movements precise and deliberate. Then it spread backward like a wave, row after row of Marines standing in perfect unison. Within moments, there were 200 Marines on their feet, and the silence was deafening. I'd never seen anything like it. This wasn't part of the standard ceremony protocol. This was something else entirely, something spontaneous and powerful that was happening in real time, building momentum with each Marine who chose to stand. Then the voices began. One voice called out my name, clear and strong across the parade ground. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, 200 Marines were calling out my name in unison, their voices carrying across the field like a battle cry. Private Cindy Rooney. The sound rolled over me like thunder, like validation, like the voice of every person who'd ever believed I could do this when I didn't believe it myself. As one, every standing Marine raised their hand in salute. 200 hands cutting through the air with military precision, 200 Marines rendering the highest honor they could give to one of their own. The sight was overwhelming, a sea of dress blues and white gloves, faces I knew and faces I'd never seen, all united in this moment of recognition. I felt tears threatening and blinked them back, holding my military bearing even as something inside me cracked open. This wasn't just about me. This was about every Marine who'd ever been told they didn't belong, every person who'd had to fight for their place, every individual who'd been underestimated and had chosen to prove their worth through action rather than argument. The salute held for what felt like eternity, but was probably only seconds. 200 Marines maintaining perfect military courtesy, honoring not just my individual achievement, but what that achievement represented, the proof that belonging is earned, not inherited, and that the opinion of people who've never tested themselves against the same standards is ultimately irrelevant. Rodriguez was grinning beside me, his own eyes bright with emotion. "That's for every time they said you couldn't," he whispered. "That's for every time you proved them wrong." I risked a glance toward the stands where my family sat. The transformation was immediate and unmistakable. My mother's hand was pressed to her mouth, her program forgotten on the ground at her feet. Her eyes were wide with what looked like shock, maybe even awe, as she processed what she was witnessing. My father's expression was harder to read. The confident dismissal was gone, replaced by something that might have been confusion, might have been recognition that he'd fundamentally misunderstood something important. He was staring at the display before him, 200 of America's finest rendering honors to his daughter, and for perhaps the first time in his life, he had no immediate criticism to offer. My aunt and uncle looked stunned, their earlier mockery forgotten in the face of this overwhelming show of respect and recognition. They were surrounded by Marine families who understood exactly what was happening, who were wiping away tears and applauding, who knew they were witnessing something special. The salute ended as precisely as it had begun, 200 hands dropping in perfect unison. But the Marines remained standing, their presence a testament to something larger than individual achievement. They were standing for the core, for the values we all shared, for the understanding that when one Marine succeeds against odds, all Marines are honored. The commander's voice cut through the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, you have just witnessed the finest tradition of the Marine Corps, Marines honoring Marines, recognizing not just achievement, but the courage it takes to earn your place among us. I felt the words settle into my bones like truth I'd been waiting my whole life to hear. This was what belonging looked like. Not the conditional acceptance I'd grown up with, not the grudging acknowledgement of people who'd never really believed in me, but the wholehearted embrace of people who'd seen me tested and found me worthy. The ceremony continued, but everything had shifted. The energy in the crowd was different, charged with the recognition that something significant had just happened. My family sat in stunned silence, while Marines around them nodded their approval, understanding exactly what they'd just witnessed. When my name was called for individual recognition, I stepped forward with a confidence I'd never felt before. The applause was thunderous, not just from my fellow graduates, but from every Marine in attendance, every family member who understood what it meant to earn this moment. Walking across that stage to receive my certificate, I carried with me the voices of 200 Marines who'd declared me worthy, who'd seen past my family's doubt to the truth of what I'd accomplished. Their salute had been a gift, but more than that, it had been a mirror reflecting back to me the person I'd become when I stopped trying to be the person others expected me to be. The handshake with the commanding officer, the formal presentation of my certificate, the photographs, all of it felt surreal after what had just happened. But as I stood there in my dress blues, surrounded by my fellow Marines, I realized that this moment would be the dividing line in my life. Everything before it had been preparation, everything after it would be lived with the knowledge that I'd been tested and found worthy by people whose opinion actually mattered. My family would have to reckon with what they'd witnessed, with the gap between their perception of me and the reality that 200 Marines had just acknowledged. But that was their work to do, not mine. My work was simpler, to live up to the honor that had just been given to me, to be worthy of the trust these Marines had placed in me, to carry forward the knowledge that I belonged exactly where I was, wearing exactly what I'd earned. After the ceremony ended and the formal congratulations were finished, my family approached me with expressions I'd never seen before. The easy dismissal was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. For people who'd spent 21 years being sure about my limitations, they seemed suddenly unsure of everything they thought they knew. My mother reached me first, her program still clutched in her hand though she'd picked it up from where it had fallen. That was incredible, she said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I had no idea. I mean, we didn't realize. She trailed off, and I could see her struggling to find words for something she'd never had to articulate before. How do you acknowledge that you've been fundamentally wrong about someone for their entire life? How do you admit that your child has achieved something you didn't think they were capable of, in front of people who clearly understood their worth better than you did? My father approached more slowly, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like caution. The man who'd spent my childhood pointing out my shortcomings, who dismissed my achievements and questioned my choices, seemed to be seeing me clearly for the first time. We didn't mean it like that, he said quietly, referring to his earlier comment about my worthiness. The words felt hollow, not because I thought he was lying, but because I realized it didn't matter anymore whether he'd meant it or not. He'd said it had revealed something true about how he saw me, and no amount of backtracking could change that. My aunt and uncle hung back, clearly uncomfortable with the shift in dynamics. They'd come expecting to witness my struggle through some misguided phase, maybe even my failure. Instead, they'd watched me receive honors they didn't understand from people whose respect was clearly hard-won. Those Marines, my uncle said, they all stood up for you. It wasn't a question. but I nodded anyway. They did. Why? The question came from my father, and I could hear genuine confusion in his voice. He was trying to understand what he'd witnessed, trying to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the Marine those 200 people had chosen to honor. I looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd shaped so much of my self-doubt, who'd taught me to measure myself by other people's standards. For the first time in my life, I felt sorry for him rather than angry. He genuinely didn't understand what he'd just seen because he'd never experienced anything like it himself. Because I earned it, I said simply. Because they know what it cost, and they think it was worth it. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, but I could feel myself pulling away emotionally. They were trying to bridge the gap with words, trying to repair 21 years of conditioning with a few awkward sentences. But the damage wasn't something that could be fixed with explanation or apology. Later that evening, at the dinner they'd planned to celebrate my graduation, they made more efforts. They asked questions about my training, about what came next, about my plans for the future. But their questions felt different now, less like challenges to my judgment and more like genuine attempts to understand something they'd missed. My mother kept looking at me like I was a stranger, which in many ways, I was. The daughter who'd left for boot camp had been seeking their approval, trying to become someone they could be proud of. The Marine who'd returned had learned to be proud of herself, and that transformation was apparently visible in ways I hadn't expected. You seem different, she said over dessert. More confident, I guess. More sure of yourself. I nodded because it was true. 13 weeks of being broken down and built back up had changed something fundamental about how I moved through the world. I no longer apologized for taking up space, no longer second-guessed every decision, no longer waited for permission to be proud of what I'd accomplished. But the most significant change wasn't visible to them. I'd stopped needing their approval to feel worthy. Their praise felt nice when it came, but their criticism no longer had the power to devastate me. I'd found a new reference point for my worth, one based on my own actions rather than their reactions. When they dropped me off at my hotel that night, my father tried one more time to address what had happened during the ceremony. I was wrong, he said. About what I said earlier. You are worthy of that uniform. I thanked him because it was the polite thing to do, but the words felt too little, too late. He was trying to correct a mistake, but he was missing the bigger picture. The mistake wasn't just what he'd said that day, but what he'd been saying my whole life. The uniform was just fabric and insignia. What mattered was the person wearing it, and he'd never seen that person clearly. Standing in the hotel lobby, watching them drive away, I realized that our relationship would never be the same. Not because I was angry, I wasn't, not anymore, but because I'd outgrown the need for their validation. I'd found something better, self-respect earned through action, belonging earned through commitment, pride earned through the kind of testing that reveals who you really are when everything comfortable is stripped away. They could choose to rebuild their understanding of who I was, or they could hold on to their old perceptions. Either way, I was moving forward with the knowledge that I belonged exactly where I was, surrounded by people who understood what I'd accomplished because they'd accomplished it themselves. The girl who'd left for boot camp seeking their approval was gone. In her place stood a Marine who'd learned that the most important opinion was her own, and that she'd finally earned the right to think highly of herself. 3 years have passed since that graduation day, and the distance between who I was then and who I am now feels like a lifetime. I'm stationed in Camp Pendleton now, leading a squad of Marines who remind me every day why I chose this life. Some of them are kids barely out of high school, some are veterans of multiple deployments, but they all share the same thing I learned in boot camp, that respect is earned, not inherited. My family still struggles to understand the choice I made. During phone calls home, they ask when I'm going to get a real job, as if serving my country isn't real enough for their definition of success. They've never quite recovered from that graduation day, from the moment when their assumptions about me were challenged by 200 Marines who saw something they'd missed. My mother tries harder now. She sends care packages, asks about my Marines, remembers the names of people I mention in my letters. It's progress, but it feels like she's trying to love a stranger, the daughter she thought she knew versus the woman I actually became. Sometimes I catch her looking at me during visits like she's trying to solve a puzzle, trying to figure out where the quiet, approval-seeking girl went. My father's approach has been different. He's become almost deferential, asking my opinion on things he never would have consulted me about before. It's like he's overcorrecting, trying to make up for 21 years of dismissal with sudden respect he doesn't quite know how to express. When he introduces me to his friends now, he mentions my rank, my deployments, my achievements. But it feels performative, like he's proud of the idea of having a Marine daughter more than he understands what that actually means. The truth is, I've stopped needing them to understand. Their approval was the carrot I chased for most of my life, but I've learned to run without it. The Marines I serve with, the ones I lead, the ones who've had my back in situations my family can't even imagine, they're my family now in ways that matter more than shared DNA. Last month, Rodriguez got married, and I was in his wedding party. During his speech, he talked about the bonds formed under pressure, about finding your tribe among people who choose you rather than people who are stuck with you by accident of birth. Sitting at that reception, surrounded by Marines and their families who understood exactly what he meant, I felt more at home than I'd ever felt at my childhood dinner table. The lesson from that graduation day has stayed with me. Respect isn't something you beg for or negotiate for or hope someone will eventually give you out of obligation. Respect is something you command through your actions, your integrity, your willingness to stand up for what matters even when it's difficult. I wear my service with pride now, not because my family finally approves, but because I've proven to myself and the people who matter that I earned my place. Every day, I get to wake up knowing that I'm worthy of the trust placed in me, worthy of the uniform I wear, worthy of the respect I've commanded through 3 years of consistent service and leadership. My Marines don't care about my college degree or my family's expectations or any of the things I once thought defined my worth. They care about whether I'll make the right decisions under pressure, whether I'll fight for them when they need an advocate, whether I'll be the kind of leader they can follow into difficult situations. And every day, I prove that I can be exactly that kind of leader. During my last promotion ceremony, I looked out at the crowd and saw faces that mattered, fellow Marines who'd served alongside me, officers who'd watched me grow into my role, junior Marines who looked up to me the way I'd once looked up to my senior leaders. My family was there too, but they weren't the center of my universe anymore. They were just part of the larger community that had gathered to acknowledge my achievements. When the ceremony ended, my father approached me with something that looked almost like awe. "I'm proud of you," he said, and I could tell he meant it. "Thank you," I replied, and I meant that too. But his pride felt different now, nice to have, but not essential to my sense of self-worth. I'd learned to be proud of myself first, and his approval was just a bonus rather than a necessity. The girl who'd gone to boot camp seeking external validation was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that the most important recognition comes from people who've been tested the same way you have, who understand what it costs to earn your place among warriors. Standing there in my dress blues, surrounded by Marines who'd seen me prove myself again and again, I realized that I'd finally found what I'd been looking for my whole life. Not their approval, not their understanding, but my own unshakable knowledge that I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do, worthy of exactly the respect I'd earned through action rather than inheritance. The lesson was clear and permanent. Respect isn't begged for, it's earned, and sometimes demanded. And that day, standing in formation with my brothers and sisters in arms, I finally understood what family really means. It means choosing each other, standing for each other, and never letting each other stand alone when it matters most. That understanding has shaped every day since, and it will shape every day that follows. I am a Marine, and I earned that title through blood and sweat and the refusal to quit when quitting would have been easier. No one can take that away from me, and no one's opinion can diminish what it means. That day taught me that respect isn't something you beg for, it's something you earn, and sometimes it comes from places you least expect. Have you ever had a moment where people finally saw your worth after doubting you? Or a time when standing tall shut down the voices that tried to hold you back? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if you believe respect is earned, not given, hit that like button, subscribe, and join me for more true stories about finding your strength and standing your ground.